Okay, hi everybody. So hopefully somebody's watching this. I didn't get a lot of responses, but I got 3, and everybody wanted me to continue doing this. So I'm gonna try and shorten them up a little, so it's not so much work on the computer for us. Anyway, okay, so this chapter this is where you really get into the neuroscience. And I know that at the end of this and the next chapter, you're gonna say, hey, wait a minute, I'm not pre-med, but it's worth looking at. Okay, so this is chapter 4. Today's 9/13. It's Sunday. So this is chapter 4. So chapter 4 and chapter 5 are the last ones that we're going to do before your first exam. Okay, so however that stretches out. Okay, so it begins on page 50 in your book. So this is all about the neural and the hormonal system. Okay, so I'm going to start, and in the very beginning it talks about Franz Gall and how he was the first one that thought, that there might actually be structures of the brain, et cetera, et cetera. And you'll probably need that for Launchpad. You won't need that for my exam. Okay, so I'm going to go straight to neurons. Okay, so neurons are the building blocks of all the communication that we have in our bodies. Okay, brain, spinal cord, your motor neurons, your sensory neurons. These are the building blocks, and there are billions and billions of connections in the central nervous system. Okay, so first of all, neurons, the structures of the neuron. Now, neurons are one nerve cell. Okay, so that was confusing to me as an early psych student. So a neuron is one nerve cell. When we think about nerves, you might think about your sciatic nerve, which is the longest one in your body. That's not a neuron. That's a bundle of neurons. Okay, so a neuron is one nerve cell, and a group of them is a nerve that we look at in the body. Okay, so what are the structures? This is clearly done in your book. I'm just going to go over it quickly. So this is on page 52. So all neurons are built the same way, basically. Okay, and I'll show you some of the differences. So first of all, you have the cell body. Okay, now coming in from the cell body, it looks like fingers. Think about this as the receiving end of the neuron. These are called dendrites. And all neurons have them. That's how they receive messages. Okay, then you have the axon. And this is what can be different in different neurons. So, for example, in your brain, the axon tends to be short, okay, and the impulse quick. If it's a motor neuron, for example, in your leg, those axons can be very long. Your book likens it to having a basketball with a 2-mile rope attached to it. Okay, so that the axons can be different lengths, but all neurons have axons. Okay, and then at the very end of the axon, and your book looks at this and calls it the terminal branches. You'll see it called other things in different psych books, but it's called the terminal branches. Okay, now some axons have myelin sheaths, or they're myelinated. Okay. How do you spell it? Myelin sheath. I got to check the spelling. Anyway, the myelin sheath is a protective coating. It's sort of like an electrical wire that has a protective coating around it. So these are largely found in your brain. And what it does is it does protect the axon, but it also helps speed up the impulse, which is important in the brain. Okay, now, the impulse itself doesn't change in speed in one particular neuron, but in separate neurons, it can be a different speed. Okay, so the myelin sheath, there's an E in there. There you go. Okay, when that disintegrates, if that is compromised, you get diseases like ALS, for example, multiple sclerosis, because once the myelin disappears or is compromised, then what happens is the neuron has a very difficult time transmitting or continuing its impulse. And that's why you get this cascade of symptoms that as the brain deteriorates, the body functions deteriorate. Okay. All right. So at the very end here, now it used to be thought that the dendrites of an adjoining or next door neuron actually touched the ends or the terminal branches of the adjoining or the next door neuron. We know that's not true now. And that's because of two individuals, and I'm just going to mention it, I'm not going to write it on the board. Okay, so the two individuals were, I'm probably going to brutalize his name, but Santiago Ramon y Cajol. He was Spanish, and he's the one that recognized that these two don't actually touch, and it was measuring speeds. The other one was Sir Charles Sherrington, a Brit. Okay, so together, their work came up with the idea that we have what's called a synaptic gap. And that's the idea that the dendrites and the terminal branches do not actually touch. Okay, so at the very end of the axon, you have the nodes that store the neurotransmitters. You've probably heard of neurotransmitters. You see them a lot on drug ads. Okay, so the neurotransmitters. Okay, and as this neuron is activated upon and fires, it stimulates at the end of the axon. A lot of books will call them the terminal buttons. You don't have to remember that, but it stimulates them to release the neurotransmitters into the synaptic gap. Okay, all right, so that's about as far as I want to go with that particular diagram, because I want to get into the firing sequence of the axon or the neuron. So I'm going to try and cover the things that I think will be the most difficult for you to understand. And again, you can follow along in your book and look at the diagrams, etc. Okay, all right, so let's take a look then at the actual sequence in a neuron's firing. Okay, so first of all, this is a chemical to electrical charge. So your brain is bathed in a chemical bath. Okay, all right, so the inside of a resting neuron, inside the cell body, etc., is negatively charged. Okay, and it's positively charged on the outside. Okay, so again, your brain is bathed in a chemical bath. Okay, so let's look at the sequence. And this is all in your book. I'm just summarizing it for you and putting it into a list that you can easily recognize. Okay, so when a neuron is just hanging out doing nothing, just waiting to be acted upon, we call that the resting potential. Okay, the next step is called depolarization. Okay, so let me explain that. 1, 2. So depolarization. So the cell body itself is semi-permeable. So when it's acted upon, it lets in some of the positive ions that are bathing it in this chemical bath. Okay, so if it lets in, and this is a democracy, it's all or nothing. Well, I don't know about our democracy, but anyway. Okay, so it's negative on the inside, positive on the outside. So during depolarization, the cell and the neuron lets in some of the positive ions on the outside. Now, if it turns out that the positive outweighs the negative, okay, if the balance turns positive, then the neuron fires, okay? So we call that the action potential. So when the neuron fires, it means that an electrical charge travels the full length of the neuron and stimulates the end of the axon to release the neurotransmitters into the synaptic gap. Okay, so that's the action potential. And it's an all or nothing response. In other words, the charge doesn't go down halfway and then stop. Either the neuron fires or it doesn't. And in a particular neuron, that speed doesn't change. Okay, all right. The next step is called the refractory period. Okay, so in order for this neuron to go back to its resting potential or to be able to fire again in quick sequence, it has to kick out the positive ions. Okay, so that's what it does during the refractory period. It kicks out the positive ions. Okay. Then we have the reuptake. Now, this is a really important step. Okay, so the reuptake stage, take, how do you spell take? Reuptake stage is when the ends of the axon, where the neurotransmitters are stored, it gobbles up as many neurotransmitters that are left in the synaptic gap as it can, for a variety of reasons. One is, if you continue to fire that neuron without gathering up the excess neurotransmitters, that neuron will get exhausted. It will exhaust its neurotransmitters and it won't be able to fire effectively. This is why many drugs are so addictive, is because it makes those axons, those neurons, fire so quickly that it exhausts itself of neurotransmitters. So a lot of times drug addicts will have to take more and more drug just to feel normal. Okay, so the reuptake stage is really important. The other thing is you don't just want an enormous amount of neurotransmitters just floating around in your synaptic gap. It can confuse your brain. So these are the stages of the neurons firing. Okay. Okay, so all right, so that's the neural transmission. Okay, another type of cell are glial cells. Okay, so you have just billions of connections of neurons in your body, a lot in your brain. Okay, glial cells used to be called nanny cells, because what they do is they bring nutrients to the cell bodies, the neurons. They go in and help mop up some more of the excess neurotransmitters. Okay, but now neuroscientists recognize that glial cells do a lot more than that. That they, in some way, they help the neurons in the brain communicate with each other. Okay, so there's a communication component to the glial cells. Now, there's many, many more times more glial cells, like 7 times more glial cells than there are neurons. Okay, so they're a very important aspect of these neural connections. Okay, all right, so let's see. Okay, so let's talk briefly about neurotransmitters, and this is on page 57. I'm just going to cover a few just really quickly that are very important. Okay, so first of all, ACH, and anytime you see an acronym like that, it means that it's a really long word that nobody can pronounce or they can't spell it. Okay, so ACH is one of the neurotransmitters, the first on this list, that we probably have some of the best understanding about. So it enables muscle action. So ACH is in between the junction of the skeletal and the muscle. Okay, so it enables muscle action. It has something to do with learning and memory as well. So examples of malfunctions of ACH are, for example, with Alzheimer's disease. The ACH producing neurons begin to deteriorate. Okay, so, Michael J. Fox, Muhammad Ali, and we do have drugs that will slow the cascade of symptoms of the disease. If you've seen Michael J. Fox on television. I've seen him do interviews and things like that. Okay, another one that's pretty common, dopamine. I think that's an A. Okay, so dopamine is another one that you hear a lot on drug commercials. So it influences movement, learning, attention, and emotion. But an oversupply of dopamine is linked to schizophrenia. Okay, and an undersupply is linked to tremors and decreased mobility in Parkinson's disease. Okay, and I'm sorry, that's what Michael J. Fox has. Okay, and then serotonin is another one. I'm going to come back to dopamine in just a second. Serotonin. That's another one you might have heard of because it does have to do with mood, hunger. Sleep is where you see a lot of individual drugs that address serotonin levels. So an undersupply is linked to depression, and some drugs that raise serotonin levels are used to treat depression. Okay, so how does this work? Okay, I want to talk a little bit about how these particular things work. Okay, so first of all, you have an agonist. Okay. All right, so an agonist is a molecule that increases a neurotransmitter's action. So how does it do it? Okay, so for example, if you want to increase the dopamine in an individual's brain, okay, and again, when you talk about some of these things, that's what we're talking about here. Okay, so an antagonist decreases and I'm on page 58. It decreases a neurotransmitter's action by blocking production or the reuptake. Okay. One of the things about schizophrenia is that it's estimated or it's theorized that individuals who have an excess of serotonin in their brains, it's not just about how much neurotransmitter is produced, it's how many receptors there are for serotonin, or for dopamine. They may very well have too many receptors that fits into. Okay. All right, so that's the idea behind this. I want to explain that a little closer, or a little better for you. Okay, so agonists increase a neurotransmitter's action. They may block the uptake or increase the release of that particular neurotransmitter. Also, agonists may mimic the neurotransmitter close enough to fit into the receptor site. So think about this with a lock and a key. Okay. God, I'm all over the place. Sorry. Okay, so if you have a lock and a key fits into it, then it opens the door. Okay, so it's the same thing with a receptor site. So if an agonist can mimic that neurotransmitter closely enough so that it fits into the lock, then it may actually get that neuron to fire. Okay, and this is where drugs come from. Many of them can mimic it. So why don't we just inject that neurotransmitter into an individual's brain? Because it won't cross the blood-brain barrier. So that's another important topic. So the blood-brain barrier is a protective device for the brain so that it doesn't allow certain chemicals, etc., to get into the brain. But it also blocks efforts by drug companies to inject neurotransmitter into an individual's brain. But some of these drugs are agonists that can actually mimic it well enough, mimic the neurotransmitter, so that it actually activates the neuron and it can cross the blood-brain barrier. Okay, whereas antagonists decrease the amount of neurotransmitter by either blocking production or releasing it. Okay, so for example, botulism. Okay, botulism paralyzes you because it blocks it blocks the production or the release. Botox is the same thing. Okay, it enables it disenables your muscles to contract so you don't get wrinkles on your face. Just remember that. Okay, now I'm going to look quickly at the nervous system itself and the components of the nervous system. The breakdown. It's a diagram. And again, you can just look at this in your book. I just want to go over it quickly. Okay, so this is on page 58. Okay, so first of all, you have the nervous system. Okay, and you don't have to memorize this, but I do find that students have, it helps them if they can sort of recall some of this diagram, if you're a visual learner. Okay, so you've got the nervous system, and then the nervous system is divided into two sections. Okay, so you have the central nervous system, which most of you know, and that's what we're going to study in the next chapter, which is the brain and the spinal cord. Pretty cut and dry. Okay, the peripheral nervous system is further divided into two. So you have the autonomic and the somatic nervous system. So the autonomic and the somatic nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is outside the brain and the spinal cord. So it's your extremities, it's your limbs, etc., etc. Okay, so the autonomic nervous system tends to control things that you don't have to think about. Okay, your digestion, etc., your blood pressure, your all these things that you function with, but you don't have to voluntarily think about it and say, well, gee, I need to digest my breakfast. Okay, so the autonomic nervous system is further divided into two, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Okay, so the autonomic nervous system is divided into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And I have a feeling that your sympathetic, your launch pad deals with quite a few questions about this. Okay, so the sympathetic nervous system is what gets you up and running in an emergency. So let's just say that your cat runs out in front of a car. Well, you get up and running pretty quick, okay? You respond quickly because the sympathetic nervous system gets everything up and functioning at the same time. So it's things like heart rate, it's your breathing, it's your oxygen level, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, the parasympathetic is what calms you down afterward. So the sympathetic nervous system wants to get you up and running really quickly. The parasympathetic calms you down more gradually. In other words, maybe first your heart rate goes down, and then your blood pressure goes down, and maybe your pupils stop dilating, etc. Okay, so this is all arranged differently on your spinal cord, and you can see that on page 59. Okay, so then the somatic nervous system is further divided into two. Okay, so you have this handwriting. Okay, so the first one is your sensory input. And the second one is motor. And we're going to cover this more when we get to the chapter on brain. Okay, so the motor output. These are one-way streets. Okay, so sensory input is what you gather from your senses. Okay, the sense of touch, for example. Okay, and all of those are rooted into the part of the brain that can interpret them. The motor output comes from the brain, the section of your brain, which we'll study next week. And it goes in the other direction. So you've got input coming from outside of the extremities, or the extremities, outside of all the way up the central nervous system to the brain. And then the brain sends messages to your motor neurons when you want to walk, or you want to, move your hands or turn your head, etc. Okay, so that's that diagram right there. Okay, all right, so there's one more thing here that you need to understand, and that is interneurons. Okay. And the best way to explain interneurons is reflexes. Okay, so interneurons bypass temporarily the brain. Okay, most of the input, okay, to your brain goes up the spinal cord, through the thalamus, and to the part of the brain that can interpret it. So interneurons go through the spinal cord, and the spinal cord talks to motor neurons. That doesn't mean that your brain doesn't get the message. It does, but this is in an event where you want to get that response quickly. So if you think about when you go to the doctor's office and they check your reflexes and your foot kicks, you can't control that. You can't say, no, I'm not going to do that. But think about a more practical use for interneurons. So let's just say, and I know we've all experienced this, you burn your hand on a stove. Okay, you pull your hand back before you even say ouch, because it's important. If that message has to go all the way from your fingertip up your spinal cord, through the thalamus, through the part of the brain that interprets, this is dangerous, and then sends that message to the motor cortex that has to go back through the thalamus, down the spinal cord, all the way to pull your hand back, you're going to have a third-degree burn by then. So the interneurons allow you to pull your hand back before the brain even gets the message. That's the best way I can explain it, because that's how your book does it. Okay, the last section of this, and I'm not going to go into great depth in this either. I guess Launchpad probably will, but I'm not going to go into great depths. Okay, the second communication system in your body, so you've got your neural system, is your hormonal system, okay, which we call the endocrine system. And if you look at this list of hormones and what they do, and the glands that go along with them, you'll probably recognize some of them. The thyroid, you probably recognize that. Okay, what I want you to know about this is that the pituitary gland is the master gland. So it helps regulate all the other structures of the endocrine system. So you've got the pancreas, you've got the parathyroids, you've got the adrenaline glands, I'm sure you've heard of that one, the testes, the ovaries, etc. What we're going to concentrate on next week is the hypothalamus, because this is in the brain. And the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are very closely related and are next door to each other in the brain. So take a look at that and answer the questions on Launchpad. But on your exam, I'm not going to ask you specifically about the endocrine system, except that it's the second communication system in the body, and also that the pituitary gland is the master gland. Now, what your author says to you is that it's a much slower system. And the reason for that is just what we said, is that neurons are electrical impulses, which tend to be, they're not as fast as a computer, but they tend to be pretty quick. In comparison to the endocrine system that releases hormones into the bloodstream. So obviously that takes longer. Okay, so I know this was really condensed, but I hope that it helps you at least to study for my exam. Okay, so I'll be talking to you during the week. Your quizzes are due by tomorrow at noon. I've already looked at several of them. About 8 or 9 of you have already submitted, and so far you've done pretty well. So I'm really happy with that. Okay, so I'll be in touch, and good luck studying this chapter.